Resident Evil Genesis, a novelization by Keith R.A. De Candido. Chapter 26. Bart Kaplan watched Alice, Rain, and the others go off into the vent even as he stuck the barrel of the revolver into his mouth. This was it. He'd screwed up enough. His stupidity got Warner, Drew, and Olga killed. His panic indirectly got JD killed. Heck, his shutting down the Red Queen was what let these zombies loose. He should pay for what he did. Even as a zombie that used to be one of the doctors clambered up the pipe toward him, he prepared himself to pull the trigger. At the last second, he pulled the gun out of his mouth and shot Dr. Zombie in the head instead. Then he threw the gun at the one behind the doctor. "You're gonna have to work for your meal!" Suicide was for quitters. Kaplan was many things, but he was not a quitter. Yeah, he screwed up, but damn it, he was doing his job. He followed orders. He did what he was told. Sometimes mistakes were made, but he was not gonna let himself take the fall. Kaplan didn't release the T-virus into the Hive. Whoever did that was responsible, not Kaplan. Pain slicing through his leg where it had been bitten, Kaplan clambered into the crawl space behind him. It led to a vent. If he was lucky, even with his wound, he could keep ahead of the zombie hordes, especially since they seemed to be temporarily fixated on the corpse of the doctor. He didn't think, didn't obsess, didn't panic, didn't do anything except focus on putting one hand in front of the other as he crawled through the vent. That worked right up until he reached the dead end. Damn. He turned around. His leg was bleeding profusely, and he could hear the march of the zombies as they came after him. Looking up, he saw great. It took about a minute for him to climb up into the hallway. The agony in his leg was white hot, but he did everything he could to ignore it and not to scream. At last, he wasn't entirely successful, but there wasn't anyone else around to see or hear him. Favoring his injured leg, he limped down the corridor. Opening his wrist top, he tapped into the Red Queen, trying to get a heat signature scan. It wouldn't pick up any of the zombies, but he could at least find the others. Some of the others, anyhow. 3 heat signatures were in one of the labs. The lowest of the 3 body temperatures was probably Rain. Kaplan couldn't tell who the other 2 were. He wondered which of them died. Was it uncharitable to hope that it was Spence? Probably, but right then, Kaplan didn't care. When he got to the door of the lab, Kaplan collapsed against it. He was beyond exhausted. The pain in his leg was now an inferno, and he couldn't move another step. Then, he saw that the locking mechanism had been shot out. Great. Drawing on reserves that JD and Rain would never have given him credit for having, Kaplan dragged himself to the other door and entered the code to get it open. He could see inside the window. Alice, Rain, and Matt were inside. Looked like Spence was the dead one. Good. Then he looked up and saw the monitor. How did Spence get to the train station? And what the hell could have done that to him? Shaking his head, he entered the code again. Nothing happened. He looked it up on his wrist top. The code he entered was the right one. Unless... You changed the code, didn't you?
It needed to be done.
Kaplan blinked. He hadn't expected the Red Queen to reply. I need to get the door open.
I'm sorry, but I can't.
Reaching into one of the pouches on his chest, Kaplan pulled out the remote control. Yeah? Well, I'm not at all sorry about this. He pushed a button. For the second time that day, he powered down the Red Queen, only this time she was permanently fried. The door, obligingly, opened. Alice was holding an axe, looking like she was ready to take someone's head off. Matt was just standing there looking stupid. Rain was kneeling in the center of the floor, hip-deep in water, looking like hammered crap. But she was the one who spoke. "Kaplan?" He managed a smile. "She wouldn't open the door, so I had to fry her." That was when something smashed against the plexiglass window. Alice raised her axe instinctively, just as the thing smashed through the window. They all ran past Kaplan into the hallway. Just as Kaplan shut and bolted the door, the whatever the heck it was crashed into the door, denting it. That should not have been possible. "What the hell was that?" "It's a long story," Alice said as she ran off. Matt, who was now carrying Rain, filled Kaplan in on what had happened, telling him about the T-virus, the antivirus, the strange monster that killed Spence, and the fact that all of this was Spence's doing. Grateful to have someone to fob his guilt off on, Kaplan hobbled behind Alice and the Rain carrying Matt to the train station. Alice was armed only with the fire axe. Kaplan was out of ammo for his Beretta and his revolver, and in any case, he'd thrown the latter away. Matt and Rain were unarmed. Heck, Rain was 3/4 dead. Kaplan tried not to think about how pathetic they were. If that thing caught up to them, they were the deadest of dead meat. Then again, they made it this far. Over 500 people had died, but not them. Alice pointed at the train. "Start it up. We'll get the virus." Kaplan nodded and limped into the train. The pain at this point had gone down to just a dull throb. Or maybe he had just gotten used to it. Whatever. Right now, he was just grateful to be one of the living and not one of the dead, or undead, or whatever the heck they were. While he started the train up, he looked out the window to see Alice going for the metal case. She closed it, just as Spence lunged at her. Alice dodged out of the way with little difficulty. The damage to Spence's corpse was such that his legs were completely shot to hell, so he was reduced to pulling himself along the floor with his arms. He made Kaplan's own struggles through the vent shaft look positively elegant. Alice gave her husband a look. Kaplan swore that if looks could kill, Spence would be a pile of ashes. Butt-kicking Alice, it seemed, was really and truly back. "I'm missing you already," she said as she hefted the axe. Then she cut his head off. Kaplan tried to not think about the fact that that was the second decapitation he'd witnessed today. Instead, he focused on starting up the train. "Okay," he said, when the telltales all indicated that the train was ready to head back up to the mansion. "We're in business. Full power." He turned to the cab. "We're leaving." Alice, he noticed, paused only long enough to remove her wedding ring and drop it next to Spence's blood-soaked body, then retrieve both the case and Rain's Colt before boarding. Matt came into the engineer's cubbyhole a minute later with a hypogun and some improvised bandages. He was also only wearing a white t-shirt. After staring at the blue bandages for a second, Kaplan figured it out. He'd cannibalized his shirt for the bandages. Silently, the cop, or whoever he was, injected Kaplan with the antivirus, then started binding his wounds. Kaplan tried not to think about the blood that felt like it covered as much of his body as Spence had on his. Instead, he focused on the report he planned to write when this was all over. And was it going to be quite a report? Knowing that Spence was responsible for all of this emboldened him. It had freed him of the guilt in many ways. Kaplan knew that Umbrella did things their own way, but Christ, a computer that slices people who try to get at it to ribbons? A big scaly thing with no eyes and teeth the size of Rhode Island running around loose? One of your top security guys turning your supposedly secure underground facility into a horror movie? And then the kicker, a virus that kills you and animates your corpse. In the past, Bart Kaplan had been willing to turn a blind eye to the less ethical areas of Umbrella, mostly because that eye was focused instead on the high number of zeros on his paycheck stub. But this was too much. He had no idea what he, a mere grunt in security division, could do, but whatever it was, he intended to find out what it was, and do it. Matt put a hand on his shoulder when he was done. Kaplan gave him a nod in return. He had no idea who this guy really was, and right now, he didn't give a crap. The four of them had been through all 9 circles of hell today, and lived to tell the tale. Right now, that was all Kaplan cared about.
I don't want to be one of those things.
Kaplan turned to look at Rain when she said those words. Alice was treating her, same as Matt had been doing for Kaplan. Rain continued.
Walking around without a soul? When the time comes, you'll take care of it.
It wasn't a question. Alice just said,
Hey, no one else is gonna die.
Rain removed the watch from her wrist and handed it to Alice. Then her head slumped forward. Any other time, Kaplan might have figured she was just lapsing into a coma or something, but he'd seen way too much death today. Rain Melendez was dead. Damn it.
Rain?
Alice spoke in a soft voice. Nothing. Kaplan shook his head. He never even liked Rain all that much. She and JD spent way too much time giving Kaplan a hard time. But they were still comrades, still teammates. And when it mattered, they looked out for each other, depended on each other. Now Kaplan was the only one left. The hilarious thing was that JD had always said that if they ever took on casualties, that Kaplan would probably be the first one to go. Instead, he was the sole survivor. Alice reached for Rain's Colt. Her entire face quivering in a way Kaplan never would have expected from butt-kicking Alice, she held the gun to Rain's head, clicked off the safety. Then Rain reached up and grabbed Alice's wrist.
I'm not dead yet.
Kaplan couldn't help but grin to go with his sigh of relief. Suddenly he found himself looking forward to getting more crap from Rain in the future. Rain, meanwhile, took the Colt from Alice's hands.
Maybe I'd better have that back.
Alice laughed.
I could kiss you, you jerk.
Kaplan was then startled by the wrenching of metal, which echoed through the train, piercing through the noise of the train's engine. He turned to see a massive claw slice through the train's wall and leave 3 scratches on Matt's left shoulder. "Get us out of here!" Matt cried to Kaplan. "Any faster and we're going to come off the rails." He turned back to face the front, right when the wall to his left was ripped away. An elongated face with no eyes and teeth that were now the size of Pennsylvania looked back at Kaplan. After the day he'd had, Kaplan had thought he'd seen everything. He was wrong. His last thought as the creature ripped into him with its claws and teeth was anger that he'd never get to write that report. Chapter 27. It took Matt a second to recover from the shock of seeing Kaplan torn to pieces by the monster. Then he shut the engineer's cabin door. He'd already mourned Kaplan once. Heck, he had mourned all of them. The black guy and the others who died in the Red Queen's chamber, Kaplan, JD, the employees of the Hive, even Spence, the knothead, and Lisa. Umbrella had done this. They created the virus, they let Spence into the top of their security division, and they created this thing, which was now running along the top of the train. It killed Spence. It killed Kaplan. It wounded Matt, and now it was well on its way to killing the remaining 3 of them. Then Matt noticed that the door on the opposite end of the train was unlatched. Alice had recovered Rain's Colt and was now in a crouch in the center of the train, ready for anything. As time had gone by, Matt was seeing more and more of the formidable presence that Alice was, and was really grateful she was on his side, in more ways than one. Lisa had picked her contact well. Running across the cab, Matt latched the other door, just as the monster tried to smash through it. This held it back only temporarily. On its second punch, it knocked the door inward, hitting Matt full on and knocking him to the floor. He managed to get his hands up to keep the door from damaging his face, but it still hurt both when the door hit him and when he hit the floor. Alice shot it 3 times in the head, which, if nothing else, distracted it from Matt. Taking advantage, Matt clambered out from under the door and ran back to the other side of the cab where the bundled metal tubes hung. Matt had noticed the tubes when they first rode down into the Hive. He wasn't in a position to ask what they were doing there then, and he didn't give a tinker's damn what they were doing there now. What did matter was that they could be used as a weapon. The creature's impossibly long tongue came shooting out of its mouth and wrapped itself around Alice's left leg. Then it pulled. Alice fell on her back, dropping the Colt. She tried to hang on to the gridwork of the trap doors to keep from being pulled in, even as Matt undid the cable that kept the tubes secured in the corner. He then charged forward, using the tubes as a battering ram to slam into the monster's head. The creature stumbled backward, not nearly as hurt as Matt hoped it would be, but at least it released its tongue's grip on Alice's leg. She quickly scrambled over toward the gun, but before she could, the tongue flew out again and literally slapped Alice down. Oddly, she gave up on the gun, and instead grabbed 2 of the tubes, which had come out of the bundle. With the first, she slammed it down horizontally onto the end of the monster's tongue, holding it secured to the floor. With the second, she drove it down vertically like a spear, through both the tongue and the gridwork of the trapdoor, skewering it. She had, in essence, nailed it to the floor. "Open the door!" she yelled at Matt. Matt turned to push the red button that would open the trapdoor the monster was standing on, and couldn't move from, now that Alice had secured it. But there was someone standing between him and the button. Rain. Her eyes were watery. Her movements were sluggish. Her mouth opened wide, showing blackening teeth. She moved to bite him, just as Lisa had. This time, Matt was ready, and he pushed her off. Reaching down, he picked up the Colt. "Open the door now!" Alice screamed. With his sister, Matt hesitated. When Alice thought Rain was dead a few minutes ago, she hesitated. Now, Matt unhesitatingly shot Rain in the head. She fell backward, right on to the red button. The monster fell right into the undercarriage, slamming against the tracks while traveling at some 60 miles an hour or so. The friction caused a huge conflagration that Matt could feel and smell even more than he could see. The heat was like an inferno, and the stench of burning flesh seared his nostrils even as the fire climbed into the cab. It wasn't pretty. It was, however, deserved. Matt then pushed the red button again. It shut the door, slicing off the thing's tongue, and leaving it behind to burn on the tracks. He and Alice exchanged glances. Matt felt more tired than he'd ever been in his life. Alice looked more alive than she had since he first met her a couple of hours ago. What a day. He opened the door to the engineer's cubbyhole. It didn't take too long to figure out how to slow the thing down. They made it fairly idiot-proof. He did so as the train pulled into the other terminus. Terminus. What an appropriate word. In silence, they disembarked. Matt still carried Rain Melendez's Colt. Alice held the case with both virus and antivirus. They walked quickly amongst the crates and boxes, heading toward the giant staircase that would take them back to the lavish mansion. At one point, they passed the metal bar J.D. had placed by the blast doors. Its countdown was at less than 10 seconds. As they went up the staircase, the blast doors closed behind them. Lisa and Matt's parents had raised their kids to be Catholic, but both of them had lapsed pretty thoroughly by the time they hit their teen years. Nevertheless, Matt found himself praying for Lisa, for Kaplan, for Rain, and for all the others who died down there. As they walked through the dining hall toward the front door, Matt noticed that Alice was starting to stumble. By the time they reached the vestibule outside the door, she collapsed in a heap, dropping the case next to her. Matt knelt down next to her, seeing that sobs were now racking her body.
I failed,
she said, her voice catching.
all of them. I failed them.
Survivor's guilt. Matt knew way too much about that. Heck, he was experiencing it himself. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his sister, face twisted, trying to bite his neck. You want to talk failure? But that way lay madness. Listen, he said firmly. There was nothing you could have done. The corporation is to blame here, not you. He indicated the case. And we finally have the proof. That means Umbrella can't get away. He cut himself off as a throb of pain shot through his left arm. Shaking his head, he went on. Get away with this. We can... The pain returned, much more than a throb this time, and focused on the 3 wounds the eyeless monster had given him on the train. At the same time, he lost all feeling in his arm below those wounds.
What is it?
Alice asked. A scream suddenly ripped from his mouth as the pain coursed throughout his body, and he fell onto his back.
You're infected. You'll be okay. I'm not losing you.
Matt barely heard Alice's words. He lay on the floor, twitching, writhing from the agony that flared through every joint, every muscle, every cell, and he screamed and screamed and screamed. Then everything went white. Chapter 28. Just as Alice was about to minister to Matt, the door opened. Shielding her eyes from the blinding white light, she saw at least half a dozen people in hazmat suits.
What's happening? What are you doing?
One of them reached for her, while 2 others knelt down beside Matt.
Stop!
She fought off the one by her with a few well-placed punches. Then 3 more tried to grab her, even as others picked Matt up and carried him out into the hall. It took her all of 4 seconds to subdue the 3 trying to hold her. Heck, after what she'd just faced, 3 bozos in hazmat suits were not going to be a challenge for her.
Matt!
The hall had been converted into a sterile zone of some kind with some stuff that looked like hospital equipment and a single examination table. Several of the hazmat-suited people were laying Matt on that table. Small tentacles started to grow out of the 3 wounds on Matt's arms. One of the hazmats spoke. He's mutating. I want him in the Nemesis program. Alice ran to grab Matt, but 2 more hazmats grabbed her first, even as they strapped down Matt and started to wheel him outside. Shattering the faceplate of one hazmat with a single punch, and kicking another in the nuts, she again screamed,
"Matt!"
For every 2 hazmats she knocked down, though, 3 more seemed to take their place, and she honestly was exhausted, mentally and physically. Even she had her limits, and she had finally reached them. She felt a needle puncturing her thigh. Kicking with that leg, she cracked another faceplate, but even as she did so, her limbs stopped responding to her brain's commands. Falling to the floor, a gray haze came over her vision. She heard a voice that was maddeningly familiar. "I want her quarantined, close observation, and a full series of blood tests. Let's see if she's infected. Take her to the Raccoon City facility, then assemble a team. We're reopening the Hive, and I want to know what went on down there." As she faded into oblivion, Alice finally recognized who it was talking. Major Timothy Abel Kane, Vice President in charge of operations. Her boss. "Just do it." Then everything went white. For a while. When Alice woke up, she was once again naked. This time, though, instead of a shower curtain, she was dressed in a hospital gown that barely covered her. And instead of a running shower, she was being pelted with something else. No, not pelted. Attached. Wires. They'd put wires into her. They were in her legs and her torso, and her arms and her head. She sat up. Pain! Awful, horrible, mind-numbing, excruciating, searing, boiling pain that ravaged every fiber of her being. She ripped one of the wires out of her left arm. The process of ripping out the wire made the pain infinitely, impossibly worse. But then it subsided. That emboldened her to tear out the ones in her right arm. Same thing. Worse pain at first, then subsiding to something almost resembling tolerable. She saved the last 2 attached to the side of her head for last. As horrendously, wretchedly bad as the pain was when she first woke up, the pain she felt when she tore the wires out of her head was several thousand quantum leaps worse. By the time the white-hot agony had dimmed to a throbbing deep pain, she tried to take stock of her surroundings. When she had woken up, she had been on an examination bed. 6 lights shone down on it. Now, though, she was on the floor in front of it. She couldn't make her legs move. Looking around, she saw that each of the wires she had rended from her flesh led to the ceiling. Aside from the lights, the one door, the wires, and the exam table, the room was white and empty, save also for a mirror. Alice was pretty sure it was a one-way window. Somehow she managed to get to her feet. Her legs seemed not to remember how to function properly. Stumbling over to the mirror/window, she slammed a fist into it, calling for help. If anyone heard her, they gave no indication of it. She wondered how long she'd been unconscious on that bed. She wondered where Matt was. She wondered if she had heard Kane properly, and if he was truly insane enough to reopen the Hive after so many had died down there. Alice Abernathy remembered everything now. She remembered reading about the T-virus. She remembered thinking something needed to be done about it. She remembered meeting with Lisa Broward. She remembered sex with Spence, then waking up to find him gone. She remembered getting into the shower, then being hit with the nerve gas. Heck, she even remembered how baseball was played. And she remembered something else, too. A memo she'd written to Abel Kane pointing out a design flaw in the card swipe mechanisms that unlocked the secure doors throughout Umbrella. A well-placed sharp point could disrupt the circuits and cause the doors to open. Kane never acknowledged the memo, Alice was willing to bet that he hadn't bothered to fix the problem. Kane was an arrogant ass. Alice grabbed one of the blood-soaked wires that had until recently been attached to her arm. She slid it into the card swipe mechanism and poked around until the door unlocked. Nope, he never fixed the problem. Jackass. She walked the hallways of what she now recognized as the Raccoon City Hospital. The wing she was in had been donated by Umbrella, and they used it for their own purposes fairly regularly. The hallway was utterly deserted. No doctors, no nurses, no patients. Nothing and no one. The quiet was deafening. Not only was there no sign of human activity, there was no sign of the possibility of human activity. Passing a closet, she grabbed a doctor's lab coat and put it on over the flimsy gown. Eventually, she found the front door and walked out. What she saw made the Hive look like a day at the park. Abandoned, smashed vehicles, buses, cars, bicycles, motorcycles, news vans. Broken pavement, overturned garbage cans, damaged buildings, broken glass, cracked facades, garbage strewn about, street lamps knocked over, smoke, bonfires, blood everywhere. But no bodies. Slowly, walking gingerly on bare feet, trying to avoid the worst of the shattered pavement rocks and broken glass, she proceeded down the street. A nearby newsstand displayed several copies of the Raccoon City Times. The front page headline read, "The Dead Walk." They'd reopen the Hive and let the infected workers loose. Bastards. Still, Alice saw no people, living or dead, or undead. She knew, however, that wouldn't last. 2 of the dozens of abandoned, shattered vehicles near her were RCPD patrol cars. She checked in one, then the other. The second gave her what she wanted, a shotgun. She checked to see that it was fully loaded. It was. Alice pumped the shotgun, and then she waited. To be continued in Resident Evil Apocalypse.